Urban exploration had always been more than just a hobby for me. It was an obsession, a way to escape the mundane and dive into the forgotten corners of the world. The thrill of discovering places long abandoned, with their peeling paint and crumbling walls, was like stepping into a different reality, one where the past lingered in the shadows. When I first heard about the motel in San Marcos, California, it instantly piqued my curiosity. The place had been left to decay for over a decade, its isolation in the middle of the Mojave Desert, making it the perfect candidate for a solo, nighttime exploration. I planned my visit carefully, waiting until the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the scorching desert into a cool, quiet expanse under a blanket of stars. Driving along the desolate highway, I felt a mix of excitement and unease, the kind that always came before stepping into a place with a history of abandonment. When I finally reached the motel, it was almost too easy to access. No fences to climb, no security patrols to dodge, just a fading relic of the past standing alone against the night sky. The motel had clearly seen better days. The once vibrant neon sign that had probably welcomed weary travelers decades ago was now cracked and missing letters, barely clinging to the roof. Half of the upstairs rooms had their doors hanging off the hinges, either left ajar or completely shattered, exposing the dark, empty interiors. The silence that enveloped the place was unsettling. No wind rustled through the sparse vegetation, no insects chirped, and no distant hum of traffic broke the quiet. It was just me and the sound of my own footsteps crunching over scattered debris. I circled around to the back of the motel, where a large, empty pool sat like a gaping mouth in the ground. Once filled with sparkling water and happy guests, it was now a canvas of graffiti, the work of previous explorers or perhaps local vandals. The pool had long since been drained, leaving behind only memories and a layer of dust that swirled in the beam of my flashlight. The stillness of the night pressed in around me, amplifying every sound, the scrape of my boots, the occasional clatter of loose gravel, and the distant echo of something unknown. I started with the ground floor, cautiously peering into each room as I made my way down the decaying hallway. Every room was a reflection of the last, walls covered in graffiti, faded slogans, and crude drawings layered over the remnants of old wallpaper. The floors were littered with broken furniture, toppled dressers, and tattered mattresses that had likely been abandoned for years. Dust hung in the air, visible in the thin beam of my flashlight, making each breath feel thick and heavy. As I continued, I began to settle into the eerie atmosphere, growing accustomed to the desolation. But just as I was getting comfortable, I heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably human. It sounded close. Too close. My heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, I darted into the nearest room, quickly switching off my flashlight. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, straining to listen for any movement. The silence that followed was almost worse than the voice. Seconds dragged on like minutes as I waited, my pulse thundering in my ears. Finally, when the silence became unbearable, I flicked my flashlight back on and scanned the room. It was empty, just the same disarray as all the others. I tried to shake off the creeping dread that was slowly crawling up my spine. It had to have been my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the isolation and the oppressive darkness. Convincing myself of that, I took a deep breath and stepped back into the hallway. I needed to keep moving. The staircase leading to the upper floor was just ahead, its once carpeted steps now bare and creaking under my weight. As I ascended, the air seemed to grow heavier, the darkness thicker. I was halfway up when a loud crash echoed from above, the sound so sudden and sharp that it sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Something, or someone, was up there. Despite the panic rising in my chest, I forced myself to continue. Each step felt like an eternity as I made my way down the narrow walkway, my flashlight sweeping back and forth. Then I heard it. A slow, rhythmic banging. Thump. 2 seconds. Thump. The sound was coming from one of the rooms ahead, steady and deliberate, like someone methodically pounding on the wall. I approached the door from which the noise emanated, my flashlight off. my heart hammering so loudly that I feared it might give me away. Standing just outside the room, I hesitated, debating whether to turn back. But curiosity got the better of me. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, announcing that I was just an explorer and meant no harm. The banging stopped. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I waited for a response, but none came. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I knew then that whatever was in that room, it wasn't something I wanted to confront, but it was too late to turn back now. I had to see for myself what was inside. I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath shallow, as I gathered the courage to peek inside. The stench hit me first, a sickly, overpowering odor of rot and filth that clawed at the back of my throat. The room was dark, a void where my flashlight beam barely penetrated. I could make out vague shapes in the gloom, discarded furniture, a tattered mattress on the floor, but it was the figure in the far corner that caught my attention. At first, it was just a huddled mass, indistinguishable from the debris that littered the room. My hand trembled as I fumbled with the flashlight, my pulse thudding in my ears. I aimed the light low, the beam trembling as it slowly crept across the floor. The light illuminated two pale, bare feet, dirty and bruised, and they were moving, rushing toward me. I jerked the light upward in a panic, and the full horror of what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a woman, or at least something that had once been a woman. Her forehead was a mess of blood, congealed and fresh, as if she'd been bashing her head against something hard. Her mouth hung open, yellowish muck oozing from her lips, and her eyes, those eyes were vacant, void of any sanity, but locked onto me with an unsettling intensity. She lunged. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. Pure, primal terror surged through me as I turned and bolted out of the room. Her screams pierced the silence, a guttural, animalistic wail that reverberated through the empty halls as she chased after me. I could hear her bare feet slapping against the floor, the sound growing closer with every second. My legs burned as I sprinted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my desperation to get away. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a shock, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, the blood roaring in my ears. Only when I reached my car did I dare to look back. The motel loomed in the darkness, silent and still, as if it had swallowed her whole. She was gone, disappeared back into whatever nightmare existed within those walls. Shaking, I fumbled for my phone and called George, my go-to partner for these urban exploration trips. My voice trembled as I recounted what had happened, the image of the woman's wild eyes still fresh in my mind. George was silent for a moment before suggesting that the thumping noise I'd heard earlier had been her banging her head against the wall, explaining the blood on her forehead. The thought made my skin crawl. George warned me against calling the police. Trespassing wasn't something either of us wanted to be caught for. But I couldn't just do nothing. I drove aimlessly through the nearby area, looking for a payphone, desperate to report what I'd seen without leaving a trace of my identity. When I finally found one, I made the call, my voice shaking as I described the deranged woman lurking in that motel. I kept it vague, claiming I'd heard the story from someone else. And then I hung up before they could ask too many questions. I don't know if the police ever went to investigate or if they found her, but whatever was wrong with that woman, she needed more help than I could ever give. In all my years of exploring, I'd never encountered anything like that, and I pray I never will again. A few years ago, when the weight of small-town drama became too much, my family decided it was time for a change. My parents set off on a trip to scout out a new house, leaving me alone at home for the weekend. With nothing but time on my hands, I quickly grew bored. That's when the idea struck me. I called up my friend and cousins, fellow adrenaline junkies, to see if they were up for a little adventure. We'd always had a taste for the eerie and unexplained, so it didn't take much convincing. This time, we set our sights on Stark Hospital, a decaying psychiatric facility with a dark past. Rumors swirled about how the patients there had been mistreated, even tortured, before the place was finally shut down and abandoned. Over the years, the building had been left to rot, becoming a shadow of its former self, swallowed by nature and time. It was the perfect target for our late-night thrill-seeking. The drive was going to be a long one, 2 or 3 hours at least, but we didn't mind. The idea of exploring a place so drenched in horror had us all buzzing with excitement. As we piled into the car and set off into the night, we had no idea just how terrifying our little road trip would become. We left around 11 p.m., aiming to reach Stark Hospital by 2 a.m., the witching hour. The car ride was a mix of nervous energy and excitement, the kind you get before doing something you know you probably shouldn't. We laughed and joked, but as the miles ticked by and we got closer to our destination, the mood in the car began to shift. The roads grew darker, narrower, and more desolate, and that creeping sense of dread settled over us like a heavy fog. By the time we finally arrived, it was almost 3 a.m., and the sight of the hospital sent a chill down my spine. The place was enormous, far bigger than any of us had imagined. The roof had caved in several places, and thick vines snaked their way up the crumbling walls, giving the impression that the building was being swallowed whole by the forest around it. The darkness was absolute, suffocating, and the only thing cutting through it were the beams from our headlights, which barely seemed to penetrate the gloom. We sat in the car for a moment, staring at the decaying structure, second-guessing our decision to come here. But after some hesitation, we finally worked up the courage to get out. The air was thick and still, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under our feet as we approached the entrance. Inside, the walls were covered in graffiti, mostly pentagrams and other unsettling symbols, only adding to the sinister vibe. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming, and every step we took echoed through the hollow, abandoned halls. We slowly made our way through the building, each room more decrepit than the last. Eventually, we found a ladder leading up to what was left of the roof. Climbing up was treacherous, with loose rungs and rusted metal threatening to give way beneath us, but we made it. From the roof, we had a clear view of the front of the building, and that's when we saw it. A light, faint and flickering, like it was coming from a phone. It moved slowly, as if someone was searching for something. "Hello?" we called out. But the light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us in an even deeper silence. My cousin, always the brave one, suggested we check out another room, but something about that light had unnerved me. Ignoring the sinking feeling in my gut, I followed them, but eventually veered off into an adjacent room. Inside, I found old, stained mattresses thrown haphazardly on the floor, more graffiti covering the walls. Then I heard it, a faint sound like a small rock hitting the window beside me. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay calm. Shaken, I hurried back to rejoin the group, finding them as uneasy as I was. We all agreed it was time to check out the basement, the final frontier of our exploration. We found the stairs leading down, though they were barely stairs at all. Just splintered wood and crumbling concrete. Getting to the bottom was a challenge. But the fear of what might be lurking kept us moving. The air down there was thick with dampness and something else, something foul. We stopped to catch our breath, the oppressive darkness pressing in on all sides. That's when we heard it, a voice, coming from the far end of the room. All the bravado we'd had earlier drained away, replaced by a cold, paralyzing fear. The basement was worse than we could have imagined. The stairs were barely intact, forcing us to navigate carefully, and by the time we reached the bottom, we were all out of breath. The darkness was absolute, the air thick with dampness and decay. We huddled together, trying to catch our breath, when a voice, low and indistinct, echoed from the back of the room. Every hair on my body stood on end as my cousin shakily lifted his flashlight, pointing it toward the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a figure squatted in the far corner, facing the wall. The man's clothes were tattered, his posture unnaturally stiff. We all froze, watching in horrified silence as my cousin slowly backed away, the flashlight still trained on the figure. As he reached us, the man turned around, his eyes vacant and unblinking. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, without warning, the man let out a blood-curdling scream and lunged toward us. Panic exploded in my chest as we turned and bolted. We didn't know where we were running, just that we had to get out. We scrambled through the basement, desperately trying to find an escape, and finally spotted a small, broken window. One by one, we squeezed through, tumbling out into the woods behind the building. I could hear the man's footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind me, too close for comfort. My heart pounded in my ears as I ran, branches slashing at my face and arms. My cousins were ahead, their flashlights bobbing in the distance. But I was falling behind. The trees seemed to close in around me, and I stumbled again and again, my whole body aching from the impact. But I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back. Eventually, we burst into a clearing and found a trail, but our relief was short-lived. We were lost, disoriented in the dark, and every shadow seemed to pulse with menace. We wandered for what felt like hours, exhausted and terrified, until we finally recognized the building again. Our hearts lifted as we saw the car, thinking the nightmare was finally over. But as we approached, a rustling in the bushes stopped us in our tracks. My breath caught in my throat as a rock suddenly flew out, striking my friend hard. The man emerged from the darkness, his eyes wild, his movements frantic. We didn't hesitate. We sprinted toward the car, adrenaline surging through our veins. He was right behind us, close enough that I could feel his presence looming. We fumbled with the doors, barely managing to lock them, just as he reached us. The headlights flicked on, and there he was, standing inches away, a crazed look in his eyes and a glass bottle in his hand. He began pounding on the windows, the glass rattling with each hit. Without a word, we floored it, the tires screeching as we sped away. The drive home was a blur, the silence in the car heavy with shock. None of us spoke. We were too shaken, too consumed by the terror of what we'd just experienced. As the miles stretched between us and that cursed hospital, one thing became clear. We'd never go looking for trouble like that again. The thrill of urban exploration was dead to us, buried under the weight of fear that would haunt us for a long, long time. When I was 16, my older brother Victor, who was 19 and had a knack for seeking out creepy places, convinced me to join him on one of his eerie adventures. This time, he had heard about an old abandoned house deep in the countryside of South Carolina. He didn't tell me who had tipped him off, but despite his usual fearless attitude, something made him reluctant to go alone. So, on a hot summer afternoon, we drove out there, parking the car in a secluded spot surrounded by towering trees. The house itself wasn't visible from where we parked. We had to follow a crumbling concrete road that had long been overtaken by nature. The road was cracked and split, with thick weeds pushing through every crevice, and the tall grass on either side whispered in the slight breeze. The silence was unnerving, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. As we walked, the only noises were our footsteps crunching on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves. That's when we noticed her, a woman trailing behind us. She was walking in our direction, her pace steady, her hands folded behind her back, as if she were just out for a casual stroll. Something about her presence didn't sit right with me, but Victor, always the cool-headed one, told me to keep walking. We tried to act natural, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her. Victor and I tried our best to act normal, even though the woman's sudden appearance had us both on edge. She continued to walk casually behind us, her hands folded neatly behind her back, a small, unsettling smile playing on her lips. As she closed the distance between us, she spoke in a strangely pleasant tone. "Lovely day today, isn't it?" We both mumbled a nervous, "Yeah," in response, exchanging uneasy glances. There was something off about her, something that made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, she said in a serene, almost dreamy voice, "I have to go to bed now." The words sent a shiver down my spine. Victor and I exchanged worried looks, silently agreeing it was time to move faster. We picked up the pace, our footsteps crunching more urgently on the gravel. The woman's presence was unnerving, and I couldn't help but glance back every few seconds. But then, in an instant, she was gone. One moment she was there, and the next she had vanished, disappearing into the dense woods beside the road without a trace. The realization hit us hard, leaving a lingering sense of dread that clung to us as we continued towards the house. When we finally reached the abandoned house, it was just as eerie as we'd imagined. Ivy clung to the crumbling walls, and the windows were shattered, evidence of previous explorers, or something else. The house loomed before us, a relic of forgotten times, and as we climbed through one of the broken windows, a wave of musty, decaying air hit us. Inside, it was like stepping into a time capsule. Old, worn furniture still filled the rooms, and when we opened the fridge in the kitchen, we were met with the putrid stench of rotten food. The smell was so overpowering it nearly made me gag, the scent of decay hanging thick in the air. After scouring the first floor and finding nothing but remnants of a life long gone, we decided to explore the basement. It was even messier down there. Loose papers and debris scattered across the faded blue carpet, the dim light filtering through small, grimy windows barely enough to see by. As we moved through the basement, a sudden, distinct thump echoed from upstairs. We froze, every muscle tensing as we listened for any other sound. But there was nothing, just the silence of the old, deteriorating house. After a few moments, Victor shrugged it off, chalking it up to the house settling. But the sound left a lingering unease as we made our way back up to the first floor, knowing that the only place left to check was upstairs. At the top of the creaky, old stairs, Victor and I found ourselves in a narrow hallway. It led directly to a small bedroom, the door slightly ajar. We pushed it open, stepping into a room frozen in time. The furniture was old but untouched, an antique dresser with a layer of dust, a faded rug, and a bed with neatly arranged sheets, as if someone had just made it years ago and never returned. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something faintly sweet but rotten, like decaying flowers. We didn't spend long in the room. It felt wrong, as though we were intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. As we turned to leave, Victor suddenly froze, his face draining of color. He whispered my name, and there was a raw terror in his voice that made my blood run cold. I followed his gaze down the hallway and saw her, the woman from earlier, standing in the doorway of another bedroom at the end of the hall. She was still smiling that same unsettling smile, her eyes locked on us with an intensity that made my stomach twist. And then, in that same serene tone, she asked, "Do you want to see what's behind my back?" The question hung in the air, freezing us both in place. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. Seb snapped out of it first. He screamed, a sound filled with pure panic, and shoved me toward the stairs. I stumbled but caught myself, and then we were both bolting down the stairs, our footsteps pounding against the wood as we raced to get out of the house. We didn't look back as we burst through the front door and sprinted across the overgrown yard. I could barely breathe, my lungs burning, but I didn't stop until we were far from the house, hidden by the thick trees. Even then, I couldn't help but glance back, expecting to see her watching us from one of the upstairs windows. But there was nothing, just the empty, decaying house looming in the distance. We ran all the way back to the car, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. When we finally made it, I collapsed into the passenger seat, gasping for air, while Seb fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. We sped away from that place, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as we drove faster than we should have down the narrow, winding roads. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home. We were too shaken, too consumed by the same terrifying thought. Who or what was that woman? And what had she been hiding behind her back the entire time? Even now, years later, I still don't have an answer, and that question haunts me every time I close my eyes.